What if the world is not collapsing, but separating? What if the strange feeling you've had lately, the sense that reality itself feels heavier for some people, but strangely clearer for others, is not imagination at all? For thousands of years, ancient prophecies, mystical traditions, and even fragments of hidden teachings all pointed toward a moment like this. A moment when humanity would no longer experience the same reality together. A moment when consciousness itself would begin dividing according to resonance. And according to this transmission, that moment may already be happening now. This is not about religion. It is not about fear. It is not about predicting the end of the world. It is about frequency, about perception, about the invisible structure beneath physical reality that most people move through unconsciously every day. Because something unusual has been happening across the planet. Time feels different. Emotional reactions feel amplified. Relationships collapse faster. Hidden truths surface more violently. People are either waking up rapidly or becoming even more deeply trapped inside fear, distraction, and emotional chaos. And according to the transmission, this polarization is not random. It is the early stage of a planetary split in consciousness. But here is where the message becomes difficult for most people to understand. The Earth is not physically splitting into two planets. The sky will not crack open overnight. There will be no giant cinematic event that suddenly announces the arrival of a 5D world. The separation is happening internally first, quietly, energetically, psychologically, spiritually. Two people can stand in the same room and already exist inside completely different realities. One person experiences constant stress, fear, competition, emotional survival, and endless mental noise. The other begins experiencing synchronicity, clarity, inner guidance, emotional regulation, and a strange sense that life is responding differently to them. Externally, the world may look identical, but internally the field of experience has already changed. And according to this transmission, only a small percentage of humanity is currently sensitive enough to recognize this shift consciously. Not because they are superior, not because they are chosen, but because their awareness has started resonating with a different level of perception. The message refers to this group symbolically as the 1%, not a financial elite, not a secret organization, but individuals whose consciousness has begun detecting the transition before it fully manifests externally. And one of the first signs is this feeling that reality no longer operates the way it used to. Old motivations stop working. Old emotional reactions feel exhausting. Drama becomes unbearable. Noise feels invasive. Certain conversations suddenly feel empty. You begin sensing that something beneath ordinary life is reorganizing itself, even if you cannot fully explain it logically. The transmission explains that this is why so many people currently feel disoriented. Because the old structure of identity is weakening while the new perception has not fully stabilized yet. Humanity is standing inside a threshold between two modes of existence. One rooted in fear, density, control, and unconscious repetition. The other rooted in awareness, coherence, presence, and conscious creation. And according to the message, every emotional reaction, every attachment, every repeated thought pattern, and every unconscious identity loop either anchors a person deeper into the old structure or gradually aligns them with the new one. This is why the next phase of humanity may not be determined by technology, politics, or external systems alone. It may be determined by consciousness itself. Because when enough people shift internally, reality begins reorganizing around entirely different principles. And this is where the transmission delivers its first major revelation. The shift into 5D is not a destination you travel to physically. It is a state of consciousness you become capable of embodying. The Earth does not suddenly change first, perception changes first. And once perception changes deeply enough, reality itself begins appearing completely different from the inside out. This separation is not punishment. It is not a judgment made by some higher force. And it is not a division between good people and bad people. It is simply the natural law of resonance. Every form of consciousness eventually moves toward the level of reality that matches its inner state. Human beings are not so different from radios. A radio can only receive the station whose signal matches its frequency. And as the Earth begins raising its foundational vibration, Those who remain locked into older emotional patterns will start feeling reality becoming heavier, more unstable, more chaotic, and strangely unfamiliar. Not because they are unworthy, and not because they failed, but because the old structure can no longer synchronize with the new energetic environment forming around the planet. Imagine placing a vinyl record designed to spin at 33 revolutions per minute onto a machine spinning at 78. The sound becomes distorted, fragmented, almost unbearable to hear. And that distortion is exactly what many souls are beginning to feel now, while trying to hold on to a dense 3D state as the planetary field accelerates toward a higher mode of consciousness. Once the distance between these two levels becomes too wide, separation becomes inevitable. But here is something important most people misunderstand. The universe never forces a soul to evolve faster than it chooses to. Some souls have already completed the lessons of survival, fear, separation, and emotional density. They are ready for a larger quantum shift. Others still need more time to experience, confront, heal, and grow through the older structures of reality. Every soul has its own rhythm. No one is above anyone else. No one is behind. This split in reality is not exclusion. It is the universe honoring free will, allowing each consciousness to continue the path it chose long before arriving here. One timeline continues holding space for the lessons of the old world. Another opens the doorway into a lighter structure of awareness for souls prepared to enter it. And according to the transmission, this process is not random at all. Earth itself is moving through the completion of a massive cycle, one that spans approximately 26,000 years, almost like a single cosmic breath. As the planet enters this transition point, an enormous wave of light and information begins flowing from the center of the galaxy into the Earth's energetic field, almost like a planetary upgrade moving through every living system at once. For plants, too much light too quickly can burn fragile roots that are not ready to absorb it. For human beings, the effect can feel like emotional collapse, instability, confusion, disorientation, or the sensation that life itself is breaking apart. But this is not punishment. It is simply the mechanics of light. Light exposes what no longer belongs and strengthens what is ready to expand. And at a deeper level, you must understand this. 3D and 5D are not just ideas. They are two completely different operating structures of reality. In 3D, matter feels dense, time appears linear, and life operates through rigid cause and effect. In 5D, reality becomes more fluid. Time loosens from its straight-line structure, and consciousness itself begins shaping experience more directly. These two systems cannot fully coexist within the same inner experience. And as Earth gradually shifts into a different energetic layer, every soul is faced with a silent choice. Hold on to the old structure because there are still lessons unfinished there, or cross the bridge into a lighter reality aligned with a new level of perception. No public declaration is needed. No spoken decision is required. The state you embody becomes the choice itself, because reality is always organized through resonance. And ultimately, the reality of an entire planet is shaped by the collective state of consciousness living upon it. If you place someone deeply anchored in fear, survival, and emotional density inside a community operating from awareness, openness, and inner harmony, that person will eventually feel disconnected, exhausted, and unable to synchronize with the environment around them. At the same time, the collective field itself becomes destabilized by conflicting levels of vibration. It is like dropping a single drop of black ink into clear water. The entire glass begins changing color. So to prevent constant energetic distortion, and to allow every level of consciousness to evolve naturally according to its own rhythm, reality begins separating into different experiential paths. No soul is abandoned. No soul is rejected. Every being is simply moving into the environment most compatible with its current state of consciousness. And this may be the most important part of the entire message. You do not need permission to enter the new earth. You do not need to beg any higher force to choose you. You do not need to struggle your way into 5D. The frequency you carry within you is already the answer. And if these words feel less like learning something new and more like remembering something ancient, then the resonance of the so-called 1% may already exist inside you. So who are the so-called 1%? Who are the people capable of feeling this shift before it fully manifests in the visible world? According to the transmission, they are not celebrities, spiritual influencers, hidden elites, or people with secret knowledge inaccessible to everyone else. In fact, many of them appear completely ordinary on the outside. They go to work. They walk through normal lives. Some are quiet. Some are isolated. Some still struggle emotionally. But deep inside, something has already started changing. The 1% are simply the souls whose awareness has begun resonating with the new field before the collective fully recognizes it. And one of the strangest signs is this. When they hear messages like this, it does not feel like learning something new. It feels like remembering something ancient, as if the words bypass logic completely and touch a place that already knew. Many of these people spent years feeling different without understanding why. They often felt emotionally disconnected from the systems around them long before awakening language ever entered their lives. Crowded environments drained them. Fake conversations exhausted them. Endless competition felt meaningless. Chasing status, approval, and external validation slowly lost its emotional grip. Not because they were better than other people, but because something inside them could no longer fully synchronize with the old structure of reality. And according to the transmission, this disconnection was never a mistake. It was preparation. The nervous system was slowly being recalibrated for a different level of consciousness. This is why many of these individuals experienced periods of intense collapse before awakening fully accelerated. Relationships ended unexpectedly. Careers stopped making sense. Old dreams dissolved. Emotional breakdowns appeared without clear explanation. Some felt like they were losing themselves entirely. But the message explains that what felt like destruction was often the early dismantling of an identity built entirely around survival and external conditioning. Because before consciousness can stabilize inside a higher reality, the false structure holding the old identity together must begin dissolving first. And this process is rarely comfortable. The 1% often go through long periods of isolation because the old emotional environment no longer feels compatible, while the new reality has not fully formed yet. This creates what the transmission calls the silent transition phase, a strange psychological space where you no longer belong to your old world, but have not fully arrived inside the new one either. During this phase, many people begin questioning everything: their relationships, their beliefs, their purpose, their identity. Some feel emotionally numb. Others become hypersensitive. Time itself starts feeling distorted. Days blur together. Intuition becomes stronger. Synchronicities increase. Random encounters begin carrying strange meaning. And perhaps most importantly, the person starts feeling an almost physical resistance toward lowering their consciousness again. They can still participate in old patterns temporarily, but something inside immediately feels heavy afterward. Drama feels toxic. Gossip feels painful. Constant negativity becomes unbearable. The transmission explains that this is one of the clearest indicators of internal frequency change. Your system no longer metabolizes dense emotional states the same way it once did. And this is where the message reveals something very important. Awakening is not becoming spiritually superior. It is becoming energetically incompatible with unconsciousness. The 1% are not people who escaped human struggle. They are people who reached a point where pretending no longer works. They can no longer force themselves to live against what their awareness now recognizes as false. This is why many of them appear to lose everything before finally finding alignment. Because reality begins removing structures that no longer match the consciousness emerging within them. Old friendships collapse. Toxic relationships fade away. Careers built only around status or survival begin falling apart. Even personal ambitions can disappear overnight. And for a while, this feels terrifying. But according to the transmission, this phase is necessary. Because the new earth cannot fully emerge through an identity still emotionally attached to the old world. The message then introduces one of its deepest ideas. The 1% are not chosen by the universe. They are simply the individuals willing to release resistance faster than the collective around them. They stop fighting truth. They stop forcing identity. They stop clinging to emotional density because it feels familiar. And as this surrender deepens, consciousness begins opening naturally. Awareness becomes clearer. Intuition sharpens. Presence strengthens. Life starts responding differently. not because they became special, but because they finally stopped interfering with the deeper intelligence already moving through reality itself. And if you have been listening to these words while feeling something inside you becoming strangely still, as if a forgotten memory is slowly waking up beneath the noise of the mind, then perhaps this transition has already begun inside you too. One of the first signs that your consciousness is beginning to move beyond the old reality is strangely simple. The things that once controlled your emotions stop affecting you the same way. At first, the shift is almost invisible. Nothing changes externally. You still wake up in the same room, walk the same streets, speak to the same people. But somewhere deep inside, you begin feeling disconnected from the rhythm you once called normal. Situations that used to trigger intense emotional reactions suddenly feel empty. Drama becomes exhausting instead of stimulating. Endless noise starts feeling invasive, almost painful to stay around for too long. And perhaps the strangest part is this. You slowly lose the ability to pretend. You can no longer smile comfortably at conversations that feel false. You can no longer force excitement for goals that no longer resonate with your soul. You can still participate in the old reality for a while, but internally, something already knows you no longer belong to it completely. Many people misunderstand this phase and assume they are becoming emotionally cold or disconnected from life. But the deeper truth is far more important. Your awareness is beginning to separate from unconscious emotional structures that once controlled your identity automatically. This is why so many people suddenly feel overwhelmed in environments they once tolerated easily. Crowded places drain them faster. Superficial conversations feel heavy. Constant competition becomes meaningless. The nervous system begins reacting differently because consciousness itself is reorganizing beneath the surface. Then another collapse begins. Old motivations slowly lose their emotional power. Things you once chased for years stop creating excitement. Status, approval, productivity, external success. You may suddenly realize that the version of life you spent years trying to build never truly belonged to the deeper part of you at all. And this realization can feel terrifying because the old identity was built entirely around those pursuits. Once they collapse, a frightening question emerges from beneath the surface. If I am no longer that version of myself, then who am I? And this is where the real transition begins. Because before a new reality can stabilize, the old identity structure must begin dissolving first. The process rarely feels beautiful in the beginning. For many people, it feels like life itself is breaking apart. Friendships disappear without explanation. Relationships suddenly collapse. Careers lose meaning overnight. Some people even feel uncomfortable in places they once called home, as if the environment itself no longer matches their internal state. And naturally, the first instinct is to rebuild the old life as quickly as possible, to force yourself back into familiar routines, familiar emotional patterns, familiar identities. But this is where the suffering intensifies, because once consciousness starts moving beyond an old structure, forcing yourself backward creates enormous internal resistance. Part of you already knows the old reality cannot hold you the same way anymore. This is why awakening often feels like destruction before it feels like freedom. The old self experiences the process as loss, but something deeper experiences it as release. Then reality itself begins responding differently. Time feels accelerated. Entire weeks disappear almost instantly. Emotional patterns return through external experiences faster than before, almost as if reality is shortening the distance between your inner state and your outer world. Fear creates collapse more quickly. Clarity creates alignment faster. Suppressed emotions surface immediately instead of hiding quietly for years. It feels as if life itself has become more sensitive to consciousness. And in many ways, that is exactly what is happening. The old dense structure allowed people to live unconsciously for decades without fully recognizing the consequences of their internal state. But as the planetary field changes, the feedback loop tightens. Everything accelerates. Thoughts carry more weight. Emotions move faster. Intentions ripple outward more directly into lived experience. This is why so many people currently feel like reality itself is speeding up beyond control. But perhaps the deepest sign of all is this. You begin losing the ability to betray yourself internally. Things you once ignored become impossible to tolerate. Your intuition grows louder every day. Your body reacts instantly when something feels misaligned. Lies create heaviness in the chest. Pretending becomes exhausting. Suppressing truth starts hurting physically, emotionally, even spiritually. It feels as if something inside you refuses to let you return to unconscious living ever again. And maybe that is the real beginning of the transition. The moment awareness, emotion, body, and truth begin aligning into the same direction. The moment the gap between who you appear to be and who you truly are can no longer survive divided. And although this stage can feel lonely, chaotic, and emotionally overwhelming, it is also evidence that the old reality is already loosening its grip on you. Because the moment the old world stops feeling completely real, another one has already begun forming beneath it. And whether you fully realize it yet or not, part of your consciousness may already be standing inside a completely different reality. There is a stage that almost every soul moving into a higher state of consciousness eventually passes through. A strange stage, so disorienting that if you do not understand what is happening, you may honestly believe your life is collapsing, that you are losing yourself, moving backward, or falling into some endless internal void. But in reality, this is one of the most important phases of the entire transition. Many call it the between space, the space between realities. It is the moment where you no longer fully belong to the old world, yet have not completely stabilized inside the new one either. The old structures begin dissolving, but the new structures have not fully formed. Familiar things start leaving your life, but what comes next still has no clear shape. It feels like stepping through a doorway and suddenly finding yourself standing in fog, unable to clearly see what exists on the other side. Everything becomes uncertain, half visible, suspended. And because the human mind desperately wants clarity, many people assume they are doing something wrong during this phase. But they are not. Disorientation here is natural. You look back at your life and barely recognize the person you used to be. The goals that once drove you no longer ignite anything inside you. The connections that once felt intimate begin feeling distant. Even the habits and routines that once made you feel safe stop working the same way. Not because you are broken, but because your inner direction is changing. Like a ship turning in the middle of the ocean, there is always a brief moment where movement slows before the new course becomes clear. And that pause can feel terrifying if you mistake stillness for failure. But this space is not stagnation. It is not depression. It is not spiritual collapse. It is a quantum transition point. Just like there is a tiny pause between breathing in and breathing out, a suspended instant where no breath enters and no breath leaves, consciousness also moves through a similar interval when shifting realities. A sacred pause between identities, between timelines, between versions of self. In this stage, you may feel like you are floating without direction. No clear ground beneath you. No obvious certainty ahead. The world around you still looks familiar, but internally it feels completely different. Strange, distant, as if you are halfway between two dimensions at once. And yet, despite all the uncertainty, something deep inside remains calm. A quiet inner knowing continues pulling you forward. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to stop you from turning back toward the old life again. Many relationships also begin dissolving during this phase. Not through conflict, not through betrayal, simply through frequency separation. Some people quietly disappear from your life without explanation. Certain emotional bonds naturally loosen. Conversations stop flowing. The connection fades without anyone necessarily doing anything wrong. And one of the hardest lessons of this phase is learning not to force what is already energetically ending. Not clinging, not chasing, not blaming yourself for the distance. Because this is not punishment. It is recalibration. Your consciousness is reorganizing itself around a different level of coherence. At the same time, you become extremely sensitive to truth and increasingly unable to tolerate performance, masks, and emotional dishonesty. You stop being able to pretend comfortably. You stop shaping yourself around other people's expectations. Anything false begins creating immediate discomfort inside your body and nervous system. It feels almost like wearing shoes that no longer fit. Painful to continue walking in. The new state of consciousness no longer allows you to survive through old identities and emotional disguises. And despite how chaotic this phase may feel, the most important thing to remember is this. The between space is not the end of your journey. It is the corridor into the new reality. Like the moments before sunrise, when the sky is no longer fully dark, but not yet fully illuminated either. Everything exists in transition, and transition itself is proof that movement is happening. So if you currently feel like you belong neither to your old life nor fully to the new one yet, understand this carefully. You are not lost. You are not failing. You are walking through the quantum doorway itself. The old world can no longer hold you the same way, and the new one is slowly beginning to reveal itself from within. When a soul begins moving closer to a higher state of reality, there is something many people fail to understand. You are not simply stepping into a new world. You are learning how to remain stable inside it. Because awakening is not a single moment. It is not one emotional breakthrough, one meditation, one realization, or one powerful experience. It is a state of being that must be maintained, protected, strengthened, and embodied over time. Consciousness is like a flame. A small wind can extinguish it when it is weak. But when it becomes steady enough, it begins generating light from within itself naturally. And if you truly want to remain aligned with the reality your soul is moving toward, there are certain inner keys every transitioning consciousness must understand. The first key is emotional release. You cannot carry years of compressed fear, suppressed pain, resentment, resistance, and emotional density into a lighter state of existence. Everything you refuse to feel becomes weight attached to your nervous system. Old grief, hidden anger, silent disappointment, emotional survival patterns. These are like stones tied around the ankles of consciousness, keeping it anchored to the old timeline. And release does not mean pretending to be positive. It does not mean spiritually bypassing pain. It means allowing what is trapped inside to finally move. Emotion is not the enemy. Suppression is. The next key is learning to step beyond linear time. As your awareness expands, reality begins behaving differently. You start sensing that the future influences the present, and the present reshapes the meaning of the past. Events stop unfolding in neat chronological order. Synchronicities increase. Inner knowing arrives before external confirmation. Life begins operating more like a living field than a predictable sequence. And this transition requires something difficult for the human mind, surrendering control. Because the more you force reality to obey old structures, the more resistance you create. But when you stop demanding certainty before movement, time itself becomes softer, more fluid, more intelligent, almost like a river carrying you exactly where your soul already knows it needs to go. Another essential key is energetic sovereignty. You must learn the difference between your own internal state and the emotional noise absorbed from others. In the old reality, most people survive by constantly adapting themselves to surrounding chaos. They absorb stress, fear, anger, social pressure, emotional projection. But in higher states of consciousness, this becomes impossible to sustain for long. A refined nervous system cannot remain coherent while continuously carrying frequencies that are not truly its own. Sovereignty means refusing to let external conditions dictate your internal state. It means not allowing temporary emotional storms to pull you out of alignment. It means protecting the clarity you are building inside yourself. Another key, one that sounds small but changes everything, is learning to live with paradox. The new reality is not simpler for the mind to understand. In many ways, it becomes more mysterious. You begin experiencing realities that appear contradictory at first, empty yet full, still yet moving, detached yet deeply connected, becoming while dissolving. The old 3D mind demands fixed answers before it feels safe enough to continue. But higher awareness moves differently. Those who can relax into paradox stabilize. Those who demand absolute certainty remain trapped in the old structure. Then comes perhaps one of the deepest shifts of all, choosing frequency before physical evidence. In the old paradigm, people wait for reality to change first before allowing themselves to feel differently internally. But the new state functions in reverse. You choose the state first, and reality reorganizes itself around that internal alignment. If you choose from fear, fear-based realities strengthen around you. If you choose openness, expansion begins responding back. This is not about forcing positivity. It is about calibrating your internal field before external movement occurs. Another profound realization eventually emerges. You are not separate from life itself. As consciousness expands, the boundary between you and reality becomes softer, more transparent. You stop feeling like an isolated human struggling against existence. Instead, you begin sensing life moving with you, through you, sometimes even for you. And even during difficult moments, something inside quietly knows you are being carried by a larger intelligence. Not as a belief, as a direct feeling of coherence with the greater field of existence itself. And finally comes perhaps the hardest key of all, learning to live without needing immediate answers. To remain steady inside uncertainty. To stop fearing the unknown spaces between manifestations. You no longer panic during periods of ambiguity. You allow life to unfold without demanding instant explanation. Not because you have given up, but because part of you now trusts the deeper movement happening beneath appearances. And when these keys begin stabilizing inside you, something irreversible happens. Even if difficult days still come, even if emotions still rise and fall, you no longer collapse fully back into the old state. Your consciousness becomes more stable than the old reality's ability to pull you downward. And if you are still listening to these words right now, there may already be a part of you sensing this shift happening quietly beneath the surface. Not as dramatic revelation, but as something softer. A movement almost too subtle to describe. A feeling like breath moving through stillness. A recognition without form. And if that feeling has begun appearing inside you, even faintly, then understand this carefully. Not everyone reaches this threshold, but you already have. At a certain point in the transition, something unexpected begins happening. You stop searching for signs outside yourself because you realize the real shift was never external to begin with. The old version of consciousness was always waiting for permission, waiting for confirmation, waiting for reality to prove that change was possible before allowing itself to fully move forward. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that dependency begins dissolving. You stop needing the world to constantly reassure you. You stop asking whether you are doing it right. And for the first time, you begin trusting the subtle intelligence moving quietly beneath your own awareness. This is where the deepest phase of embodiment begins. Not intellectual understanding, not spiritual entertainment, not collecting concepts about awakening while continuing to live from the same unconscious identity. Real embodiment means the truth moves from the mind into the nervous system, into the body, into the way you breathe, speak, choose, react, rest, love, and move through ordinary life. At first, many people mistake awakening for emotional intensity. They chase powerful experiences, mystical sensations, dramatic synchronicities, altered states, energetic highs. But eventually consciousness matures beyond the addiction to spiritual stimulation. Because true alignment is often quieter than the ego expected. It does not always feel explosive. Sometimes it feels like simplicity, like peace returning where chaos once lived, like no longer fighting yourself every moment internally. The shift becomes visible through ordinary things, through the way you respond during stress, through how quickly you recover emotionally, through your ability to remain present without needing constant distraction, through the way your body instantly recognizes what drains it and what nourishes it. Embodiment means your awareness no longer disappears the moment life becomes uncomfortable. You remain connected to yourself even during uncertainty. And this changes reality more than people realize. Because the external world does not only respond to thoughts, it responds to the state you consistently occupy. Temporary emotions matter far less than the identity your nervous system repeatedly returns to every day. This is why two people can repeat the exact same affirmations while receiving completely different outcomes. One speaks from mental effort. The other speaks from embodied certainty. One still internally expects collapse. The other has begun stabilizing trust at the level of the body itself. Reality responds differently because coherence has changed. And the deeper this embodiment becomes, the less you feel the need to force manifestations constantly. You stop chasing outcomes with desperation because part of you already feels connected to the version of reality you once thought was separate from you. There is less panic, less grasping, less emotional survival attached to every result. Not because you stopped caring, but because your relationship with existence itself has changed. Another subtle transformation also begins happening. Silence stops feeling empty. Solitude stops feeling threatening. You no longer need constant noise to avoid yourself. In fact, many people entering this stage begin craving stillness more than stimulation. Because stillness is where the deeper signal becomes audible. The mind grows quieter. Intuition sharpens. And life begins revealing guidance through feeling rather than force. This is also where many people finally understand why the old reality felt so exhausting. It required constant performance, constant mental noise, constant emotional reaction. But the new state operates differently. Less force, more alignment, less chasing, more allowing, less survival, more presence. And ironically, this is where reality often begins changing faster than ever before. Not because you are controlling the quantum field harder, but because you are interfering with it less. The internal resistance weakens. The nervous system softens. Awareness becomes clearer. And suddenly life starts moving with a strange kind of intelligence you cannot fully explain logically. Doors open without forcing. People appear at the right moment. Opportunities align naturally. Synchronicities increase. Not as magic tricks, but as reflections of internal coherence stabilizing over time. And perhaps the most profound realization of all begins emerging quietly beneath everything else. You were never separate from the reality you were trying so desperately to reach. The separation itself was part of the illusion. The moment embodiment begins stabilizing, the distance between you and the life your soul recognizes starts collapsing naturally. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like dawn slowly replacing night without asking permission from darkness first. And maybe that is what this entire journey was truly about from the beginning. Not becoming someone else, but finally becoming unable to abandon yourself ever again. Eventually, there comes a point in the transition where something irreversible happens. You realize you cannot fully return to the old version of yourself anymore. Even if you try, even if part of you wants to. The old emotional patterns may still appear occasionally. Fear may still rise. Doubt may still move through the mind. But something fundamental has changed beneath all of it. The old reality no longer feels completely believable the way it once did. It is almost like waking up from a dream and trying to fall back asleep while already knowing it was only a dream. You can imitate the old patterns for a while, but you cannot fully become unconscious inside them again. This is what many people misunderstand about awakening. They imagine transformation as becoming permanently peaceful, permanently enlightened, permanently untouched by human emotion. But the real shift is far more subtle than that. The emotions may still come. The difficult days may still happen. But your relationship with them changes completely. Before, fear consumed your identity. Now, fear becomes something you witness moving through you temporarily. Before, emotional pain defined reality itself. Now, part of you remains aware even inside the experience. A quiet observer begins existing beneath every reaction. And once that observer stabilizes, consciousness can never fully collapse into unconsciousness the same way again. This is why many people entering higher states of awareness suddenly feel disconnected from old environments they once desperately needed. Places built entirely around distraction, conflict, status, gossip, emotional manipulation, or survival begin feeling almost unbearable to remain inside for long periods. Not because you judge those environments, but because your nervous system no longer resonates with them naturally. Your internal state has shifted too far. And one of the clearest signs of this transition is how quickly your body now responds to misalignment. A conversation can drain you instantly. A false interaction can create tightness in the chest. Certain environments suddenly feel heavy before anything visibly happens externally. It is as if your body begins detecting truth before the mind can logically explain it. The deeper the transition goes, the more sensitive consciousness becomes to authenticity. And slowly, another realization emerges. The old identity was exhausting because it required constant maintenance, constant performance, constant self-protection, constant emotional management. You were always trying to control perception, secure validation, defend identity, survive uncertainty. But as awareness expands, something softer begins replacing that survival state. You stop trying to force yourself into predefined roles. You stop shaping your entire existence around how others perceive you. You stop carrying emotional armor every moment of the day. And in that softening, Enormous energy returns to the system naturally, not because life became easier externally, but because internal resistance finally begins dissolving. This is also where many people begin experiencing reality differently in practical ways. Synchronicities increase dramatically. Opportunities appear unexpectedly. Certain desires manifest with unusual speed. Encounters feel strangely orchestrated. The right person arrives at the exact moment needed. Information appears before problems fully emerge. Life begins feeling responsive, almost alive in a new way. And although the rational mind tries to explain these moments as coincidence, something deeper inside recognizes a larger pattern moving. Beneath them, reality starts behaving less like a rigid mechanical system and more like a living mirror responding to consciousness itself. But perhaps the most important transformation is this. You stop asking reality for permission to become who you already are. The old consciousness constantly waited for evidence before trusting itself. It waited for guarantees before moving. It waited for certainty before surrendering. But eventually, the inner knowing becomes stronger than the need for external proof. You begin walking forward before seeing the entire path. You trust the feeling before the physical evidence arrives. You stop negotiating with your deeper truth every time fear appears. And this changes everything. Because the moment consciousness stops fighting itself, enormous amounts of trapped life force become available again. Clarity strengthens. Presence deepens. Intuition sharpens. And the strange thing is, from the outside your life may still appear completely ordinary. You still wake up, work, speak, move through daily routines. But internally, reality feels entirely different. Lighter, more connected, more intelligent somehow. As if life is no longer happening against you, but moving with you. And maybe this is the true meaning of entering the new earth. Not escaping the physical world, but finally learning how to exist inside it without abandoning your consciousness anymore. Not transcending humanity, but becoming fully present within it. Because once the deeper awareness inside you stabilizes strongly enough, there is no real way back to sleep again. The old reality may still exist around you, but it no longer fully exists inside you. And that changes everything. There comes a moment in the transition where the universe stops asking quietly and begins asking clearly. A moment where consciousness itself stands before a final inner crossroads. Not dramatic on the outside, not some giant cosmic event visible in the sky, but internally, it feels unmistakable. You begin sensing that every choice now carries weight. Every reaction matters. Every emotional attachment either pulls you deeper into the old structure or moves you further into alignment. With the new reality already forming beneath the surface of the world. This is what many call the final choice point. And the strange thing is, most people do not recognize it when they arrive there, because it rarely appears as one huge life-changing moment. Instead, it hides inside ordinary decisions, inside subtle reactions, inside the quiet moments no one else sees. It appears in the conversation where you almost betray your truth just to stay accepted. In the relationship you already know is draining your spirit, but continue holding onto from fear of being alone. In the habit your body has outgrown, but your identity still clings to because it feels familiar. In the emotional pattern you promised yourself you would release, but keep feeding unconsciously every day. This is why the final choice point is not really about external circumstances. It is about internal allegiance. Which reality are you truly feeding with your attention, emotions, actions, and identity? Because consciousness does not shift through intellectual agreement alone. It shifts through embodiment, through repetition, through the emotional states you continuously return to when no one is watching. And at this stage of the transition, the separation between realities begins accelerating rapidly. The old world grows louder, more reactive, more chaotic. Fear intensifies. Division increases. Emotional manipulation becomes stronger. It almost feels as if reality itself is amplifying unconsciousness to keep people emotionally trapped inside it. But simultaneously, another reality becomes available beneath the noise. A quieter reality. A more coherent reality. One built not on fear and survival, but on presence, awareness, emotional responsibility, and inner stability. And what determines which reality you experience is not merely what you say you believe. It is the state you repeatedly live from. This is why many people feel extreme emotional pressure during this phase. Old wounds surface one final time. Deep fears return unexpectedly. Situations appear specifically designed to trigger unconscious reactions. And it can feel confusing because just when you believed you had healed, life suddenly confronts you with another wave of intensity. But this is not failure. It is exposure. Anything unstable inside consciousness must become visible before coherence can fully stabilize. The final choice point reveals where your awareness still unconsciously abandons itself. And each time you choose presence instead of panic, truth instead of performance, alignment instead of emotional survival, consciousness strengthens in the new direction. Slowly, the nervous system learns that safety no longer comes from controlling the external world. Safety begins emerging from internal coherence itself. And eventually, a subtle threshold is crossed. The old emotional hooks stop working the same way. The old triggers lose intensity. The old fears stop fully controlling perception. The external world may still contain chaos, but internally, something remains centered beneath it. Not because life became perfect, but because awareness stopped collapsing every time imperfection appeared. This is the true shift. Not escaping difficulty, but no longer losing yourself inside it. And perhaps this is why so few people fully cross this threshold. Because the old identity always wants proof before surrender. It wants guarantees before transformation. But the deeper reality only opens once consciousness chooses alignment before certainty arrives. The doorway appears after the internal decision, not before. And if you are listening carefully now, you may already feel this choice point moving inside your own life. Quietly, repeatedly, through the smallest moments, through the decisions no one else notices, through the subtle tension between who you used to be and who your consciousness is becoming. And maybe the most important realization of all is this. The future reality is not waiting somewhere far away from you. It is being chosen moment by moment through the state you are embodying right now. One of the greatest misunderstandings about this transition is the belief that those who do not move into the new state of consciousness are somehow being abandoned, punished, or left behind. But that is not what is happening at all. No soul is rejected by existence. No consciousness is condemned for evolving at a different pace. The separation unfolding across humanity is not a reward system. It is resonance. Every soul continues moving toward the reality most aligned with the lessons it still needs to experience. And for many people, the old structure of reality is not a prison to escape from yet. It is still a classroom. There are still experiences they came here to complete. Still attachments they must understand. Still fears they must confront. Still identities they need to outgrow through direct experience rather than spiritual theory. This is why the so-called 99% are not failures. They are simply continuing their journey within a denser level of consciousness for now. And perhaps the most difficult thing for awakening souls to accept is this. You cannot force another person to awaken before they are internally ready. No amount of explaining, convincing, saving, healing, or spiritual knowledge can replace direct realization. Consciousness only expands when the soul itself becomes willing to see beyond its current structure of identity. Until then, even truth feels threatening. This is why so many people currently reject conversations about awareness, emotional responsibility, or inner transformation. The old identity experiences awakening as danger because awakening dissolves the structures it built its sense of safety around. Fear survives through familiarity. Even suffering can feel safer than change when it has become emotionally normalized for long enough. And this creates one of the strangest experiences during the transition. Two people can stand beside each other physically, yet live inside completely different realities psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. One person sees collapse everywhere. Another sees transformation. One sees chaos. Another sees exposure. One experiences constant fear and emotional survival. Another begins sensing intelligence moving beneath the disorder. Externally, they may share the same world, but internally they are no longer interpreting reality through the same consciousness. This is why awakening often creates distance between people who once felt deeply connected. Not because love disappears, but because perception itself changes. The conversations that once bonded you may no longer resonate. The emotional patterns that once held relationships together begin dissolving. One person continues feeding old cycles while the other begins stepping beyond them. And over time, the energetic distance becomes impossible to ignore. Many awakening souls suffer deeply here because they still want to bring everyone with them. They want the people they love to see what they now see, to feel what they now feel, to recognize the deeper movement happening beneath the surface of life. But one of the hardest spiritual lessons is learning that every soul awakens in its own timing. Trying to drag someone into higher awareness before they are ready usually creates resistance, conflict, and emotional exhaustion for both people. Because awakening cannot be imposed from the outside. It must emerge from within. And strangely, the more deeply consciousness stabilizes, the less judgment it carries toward those still operating from fear, unconsciousness, or emotional survival. Compassion grows naturally. You begin realizing that every human being is moving through layers of conditioning, pain, memory, and identity structures far older than this current lifetime. Some souls are just beginning lessons others completed long ago. Some are awakening now. Some will awaken later. But every path remains part of the same larger movement of consciousness evolving through experience. This understanding changes how you relate to humanity itself. You stop seeing people as awake or asleep in a superior sense. You begin seeing consciousness unfolding at different stages of remembrance. And perhaps this is one of the deepest shifts of all. The need to save others begins dissolving. Not because you stop caring, but because you finally understand that forcing transformation is another form of control. Instead, your role becomes embodiment, presence, living the frequency rather than preaching it constantly. Because people feel coherence far more deeply than they hear information. And often, the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain grounded in your own awareness while the world around you moves through chaos. Your nervous system becomes evidence that another way of living is possible. Your peace becomes permission for others to soften. Your authenticity becomes a mirror quietly inviting others to remember themselves when they are ready. And this is where the transition reveals its deepest truth. The new earth is not built through separation rooted in superiority. It is built through consciousness stabilizing into greater levels of compassion, responsibility, presence, and internal truth. Some souls will arrive there sooner, others later, but existence loses none of them. Because every path, no matter how dense or painful, is still part of consciousness learning itself through human experience. And perhaps the real awakening begins the moment you stop trying to escape humanity and finally learn how to love it while remaining conscious inside it. And then, eventually, the question changes completely. In the beginning of awakening, most people ask, how do I change my reality? How do I manifest faster? How do I escape suffering? But after consciousness moves through enough dissolution, enough exposure, enough internal transformation, another question quietly begins emerging beneath all the others. Who is the one trying so hard to control reality in the first place? And this question changes everything, because slowly, you begin realizing that the old self was built almost entirely around resistance. Resistance to uncertainty, resistance to emotional pain, resistance to not knowing, resistance to imperfection. The mind spent years trying to manipulate reality into a shape that felt safe enough for the nervous system to survive inside. But the deeper awakening reveals something shocking. The more consciousness fought reality, the more fragmented reality appeared in return. The struggle itself reinforced separation. This is why so many people reach a point where manifestation techniques stop working the way they once did. Constant visualization, forced affirmations, endless attempts to control outcomes mentally. At first, these methods may create temporary movement because attention carries creative power, but eventually consciousness begins maturing beyond force-based creation. It starts understanding that the state beneath the technique matters more than the technique itself. Fear repeating positive words still creates fearful realities underneath the surface. Lack pretending to be abundance still carries the emotional signature of lack. The field responds less to performance and more to coherence. And this realization can feel deeply uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that reality can be manipulated while consciousness remains internally divided. The nervous system itself becomes part of the manifestation process. Your body is no longer just a passive container carrying awareness. It becomes the instrument through which reality is interpreted, stabilized, and projected outward. This is why unresolved emotional survival patterns distort perception so powerfully. A person living in chronic fear may unconsciously interpret neutral situations as threatening. A person carrying abandonment wounds may continuously create relationships reflecting emotional instability. A person addicted to control may sabotage flow every time uncertainty appears. And none of this happens as punishment. It happens because consciousness continuously organizes external experience around its dominant internal state. But then another shift begins occurring. Instead of asking, "How do I control reality?" awareness starts asking, "What state of being am I continuously returning to?" And this question opens the real doorway. Because reality transformation does not happen primarily through effort. It happens through identity stabilization. The nervous system learns through repetition which emotional environment is home. If chaos becomes familiar, the body unconsciously recreates chaos. If emotional suffering becomes normalized, peace may initially feel unsafe or unnatural. This is why entering a higher state of consciousness often feels uncomfortable at first. The body has to learn how to survive without emotional struggle as its primary orientation. And this retraining takes time, patience, compassion, presence. You begin noticing how often the mind tries to pull awareness back into old loops simply because they are familiar. Old fears, old stories, old emotional reactions, old identities. And every moment of conscious presence interrupts those unconscious cycles slightly more. Slowly, awareness stops automatically collapsing into every passing thought or emotional wave. Space appears between stimulus and reaction. And inside that space, freedom begins emerging. This is also why stillness becomes so important during the transition. Silence allows unconscious patterns to surface clearly. Constant distraction keeps consciousness trapped in automatic behavior. Many people fear silence because silence exposes what noise was hiding. But eventually, stillness becomes sacred. It becomes the environment where the deeper self can finally be heard beneath all the conditioning. And the deeper consciousness stabilizes, the less dramatic external manifestation becomes necessary for inner fulfillment. You stop needing reality to constantly prove your worth. You stop measuring your value through outcomes alone. Presence itself begins feeling nourishing. Existence itself begins feeling enough. Not because desire disappears, but because your relationship to desire changes completely. Desire stops coming from emotional emptiness and begins flowing from creative alignment instead. And ironically, this is often when reality begins responding more effortlessly than before. Because the internal war weakens, the nervous system softens, consciousness becomes less fragmented, the signal grows clearer. Life starts reflecting internal coherence with increasing precision. Not instantly, not perfectly, but undeniably. And maybe this is the deeper meaning behind what so many teachings attempted to explain for centuries. Reality was never only changing around you. Consciousness was learning how to stop separating itself from life in the first place. The external transformation was always a mirror of an internal reunion, a return, a remembering. And perhaps the greatest shift of all happens quietly at the end of this realization. You stop trying to become worthy of reality and begin understanding that your existence itself was never separate from it to begin with. And perhaps this is where the deepest realization of the entire journey finally arrives. The transition was never truly about escaping the old world. It was about remembering how to remain conscious inside it. For so long, humanity believed awakening meant leaving reality behind, transcending the body, escaping emotion, detaching from human experience entirely. But the deeper truth reveals something very different. Consciousness did not come here to reject physical existence. It came here to fully enter it without forgetting itself in the process. The real transformation was never about becoming less human. It was about becoming fully present as a human being for the very first time. Because most people were never truly living. They were reacting, repeating patterns, surviving emotional conditioning inherited through family, society, fear, memory, and unconscious identity structures passed from one generation to another. Entire lives were built on automatic responses, automatic fear, automatic striving, automatic self-rejection. But awakening interrupts the automatic cycle. It creates space between awareness and conditioning. And inside that space, a completely different reality becomes possible. Not because the external world suddenly becomes perfect, but because consciousness is no longer fully trapped inside unconscious reaction. And maybe this is why so many people feel both grief and liberation during the transition at the same time. Grief for the old identity dissolving. Grief for the years spent abandoning themselves. Grief for the relationships, dreams, and versions of life built from unconsciousness. But alongside the grief, something else quietly emerges. Relief. Relief from constantly pretending. Relief from endless internal conflict. Relief from carrying identities that never truly belonged to the deeper self. The nervous system slowly stops fighting existence every moment of the day. And for the first time, many people begin experiencing what true presence actually feels like. Not as a spiritual concept, but as a living state. A moment where the mind softens. The body relaxes. The future no longer needs to be controlled constantly. The past no longer defines identity completely. There is simply this moment, this breath, this awareness existing directly inside life itself. And strangely, this simplicity often feels more powerful than all the dramatic spiritual experiences that came before it. Because the soul was never truly searching for stimulation. It was searching for reunion. Reunion with presence. Reunion with truth. Reunion with the part of itself that existed before fear taught it to separate from life. And perhaps this is why the final stage of awakening often appears so ordinary externally. There may be no dramatic announcement, no visible sign proving transformation occurred. Life may continue looking simple from the outside, but internally, everything has changed. The war between consciousness and reality begins ending. Resistance weakens. The need to constantly become someone else dissolves. You stop chasing wholeness because something inside finally recognizes it was never truly broken. And from this state, reality begins unfolding differently. Not because you are forcing the quantum field to obey your desires, but because your consciousness is no longer fighting itself at every level. Coherence returns. Clarity returns. Presence returns. And life begins responding to that stability naturally. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but with a different quality entirely. A softer intelligence, a deeper flow, a feeling that existence is no longer something happening against you, but something moving with you. And if you have made it this far into the transmission, there is probably already a part of you recognizing these words beyond the level of thought. Not because someone else gave you truth, but because something ancient inside you remembers it already. Maybe that is what awakening always was. Not learning something new, but finally remembering what consciousness was before the world taught it to forget itself. And maybe this entire journey was never truly about becoming someone new. Maybe it was about slowly removing every layer that convinced you were separated from yourself in the first place. The fear, the conditioning, the endless mental noise, the identities built from survival instead of truth. Because the moment consciousness stops fighting itself, reality begins responding differently. Not instantly, not magically, but deeply, quietly, naturally. You stop living as someone trapped inside life and begin experiencing yourself as part of the living field itself. And if something inside you recognized this transmission, if part of you felt these words beyond logic, then perhaps your transition has already begun. Not because you were chosen by something outside yourself, but because your awareness is finally ready to remember what it always was beneath the noise. So the next time fear appears, the next time uncertainty rises, pause for a moment and remember this. You are not the thought passing through your mind. You are the awareness witnessing it. And the moment you stop identifying with every passing reaction, reality itself begins changing shape around you. If this message resonated with you, write in the comments, I am not the thought. I am the awareness. Because the moment you declare it consciously, something inside you begins stabilizing around a completely new identity. And if you're ready to continue exploring consciousness, inner transformation, and the hidden mechanics behind reality itself, subscribe this channel and join us on this journey inward. Because the deepest shift does not happen when you escape the world, It happens when you finally remain fully conscious inside it.